experimentally valuable. They allow prediction and intervention, but correlation is not explanation. Identifying neural activity that accompanies experience does not explain why that activity gives rise to experience. The explanatory gap remains. Francis Crick emphasized this by deliberately speaking of neural correlates. The correlation is established, the mechanism is not. In other areas of science, correlation preceded explanation. Heat was correlated with molecular motion before statistical mechanics explained why. Genes were linked to traits before molecular biology revealed the mechanism. It is tempting to expect a similar resolution here. Yet consciousness may be different. Heat and molecular motion are both physical properties. Their relationship admits of physical explanation. Information processing and subjective experience appear to occupy different conceptual categories. One objective and publicly accessible, the other subjective and privately given. This difference suggests the gap may not be a temporary absence of theory. The problem can be stated simply. Informational descriptions specify what systems do. They map states, transitions, and causal structure. Conscious experience has a what-it-is-like character absent from these descriptions. No informational fact, however elaborate, seems to logically require the existence of qualitative experience. Structure and dynamics yield only more structure and dynamics. The felt dimension remains unaccounted for. Comparisons with earlier scientific mysteries often fail at this point. When 19th century physicists lacked an explanation of heat, the explanandum and explanans belong to the same domain. Consciousness does not share this feature. Information processing is third person and objective. Experience is first person and qualitative. The correlation is evident, but the connection resists the kind of explanation that succeeded elsewhere. Consider pain. Neuroscience can identify patterns of neural activity, C fiber firing, spinal transmission, cortical activation. This informational description is comprehensive. It specifies which neurons fire when and how they interact. Yet it does not explain why this pattern feels like pain rather than something else, or rather than nothing at all. The structure is fully described. The experience is not. Joseph Levine made this point explicit. Knowing that C fibers fire does not explain why pain feels the way it does. Nothing in the physical description renders the phenomenal quality inevitable. The connection appears contingent rather than necessary. This is not ignorance of missing data. Even with complete physical and informational knowledge, the question would persist. Why does this feel like pain? The theory offers no answer. Some suggest the problem dissolves once we recognize consciousness as identical to information processing. The gap on this view is linguistic, but identity claims require justification. In other reductions, bridge principles explain why macro properties follow from microstructure. Water is H2O because chemical bonding explains its behavior. Heat is molecular motion because kinetic theory explains thermal phenomena. Consciousness lacks an analogous bridge. At this point, the difficulty is clear. Informational explanation reaches extraordinary depth, but it stops short of accounting for experience itself. The gap is not peripheral. It emerges at the center of any attempt to explain consciousness in informational terms. Consciousness and information processing lack a connecting explanation. We observe correlation without intelligibility. The informational facts do not make experiential facts appear natural, expected, or inevitable. Philosophers have long used thought experiments to clarify this difficulty. Consider a scientist named Mary, who has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She has learned all physical and neurological facts about colour vision, wavelengths, photoreceptor responses, neural pathways, encoding mechanisms. By any informational standard, her knowledge is complete. Then Mary leaves the room and sees red for the first time. The question arises, does she learn something new? Many philosophers answer yes. She learns what red looks like. She acquires experiential knowledge that was absent despite her informational completeness. This suggests that experiential facts are not entailed by informational facts alone. Critics respond that Mary gains only new abilities or new forms of acquaintance, not new facts. She learns how to recognize red or becomes directly acquainted with the experience, but the underlying facts were already known in abstract form. This reply remains disputed. The intuition persists that encountering red for the first time introduces something genuinely new, a qualitative aspect missing from the physical description, regardless of its completeness. A related thought experiment concerns philosophical zombies. Imagine a being physically and informationally identical to a conscious human, but entirely lacking inner experience. The zombie processes information in the same way, behaves identically, and exhibits the same neural activity patterns. Yet subjectively, there is nothing it is like to be this creature. If such a zombie is conceivable, consciousness cannot be logically necessitated by physical and informational facts alone. The zombie world would be informationally indistinguishable from ours while differing experientially. Consciousness would appear as an additional fact, not captured by informational description. Some argue that zombies are not genuinely conceivable. The apparent coherence reflects incomplete understanding of what information processing entails. With a proper grasp of the relevant processes, consciousness would be seen as unavoidable. But this response bears a burden. It must explain why zombie conceivability is illusory. It must identify what specific feature of information processing makes consciousness inevitable. No agreed-upon account currently satisfies this requirement. Together, these thought experiments target logical entailment. Even complete informational descriptions do not logically require experiential facts. A conceptual gap persists between the two kinds of description. Some philosophers take this to indicate that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, not reducible to structure or information. Others maintain that the gap is epistemic rather than ontological, a limit of understanding rather than of nature itself. Neuroscience, meanwhile, has identified many reliable correlates of consciousness. Certain patterns of synchronized neural oscillation accompany conscious perception. Activity in specific cortical networks predicts conscious access. Disrupting these patterns temporarily removes consciousness. These findings are scientifically significant. They allow prediction and control. They constrain viable theories, but they do not explain why these neural patterns generate experience. The correlation remains unexplained. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch emphasized this distinction in their early work. They deliberately spoke of neural correlates rather than mechanisms, remaining neutral about explanation. The goal was to identify which neural activity accompanies consciousness without prematurely claiming to explain how or why. That caution proved warranted. Decades later, robust correlates are well established, but explanatory understanding remains limited. We know what occurs in the brain when consciousness is present. We do not know why these occurrences produce subjective experience. One influential attempt to address this gap is integrated information theory, proposed by Giulio Tononi. IIT seeks to quantify consciousness using a measure called I. Systems with high integrated information irreducible to independent components, are said to possess consciousness in proportion to their phi value. The theory has generated extensive research and debate. It makes specific predictions about which systems should be conscious based on information processing architecture. It offers a mathematical framework for assessing consciousness. Yet IIT faces conceptual obstacles. It identifies consciousness with integrated information, but the identification is asserted rather than derived. Nothing in the formalism explains why integrated information should feel like anything. The theory describes informational structure without accounting for experiential quality. Critics note that integration, as measured by phi, is entirely structural. It quantifies how information is organized and constrained. This remains a third-person description. The first-person character of experience is not captured. Anil Seth has emphasized this concern. He argues that while IIT may successfully describe certain information processing properties, it does not explain why those properties give rise to experience. The identity between consciousness and integrated information is posited, not demonstrated. IIT also produces unexpected implications. Systems with relatively simple architectures can yield high phi if their components are sufficiently interconnected. This suggests consciousness may be widespread, potentially present in systems ordinarily regarded as unconscious. Some accept this conclusion, adopting a form of panpsychism in which consciousness is ubiquitous but varies in degree. Others see it as evidence that phi fails to measure consciousness at all. The debate reflects a broader difficulty. Any attempt to identify consciousness with information processing patterns must explain why that pattern generates experience. Informational description remains structural and objective. Consciousness appears to demand something more. Emergence is often proposed as a solution. Perhaps consciousness emerges from information processing in ways not yet understood. Complex systems can exhibit properties absent from their components. Perhaps experiential properties arise similarly, but emergence must be specified. Weak emergence refers to properties that are unexpected, but ultimately reducible to component interactions. The liquidity of water is weakly emergent, surprising but explainable through molecular behavior. Strong emergence involves properties that are genuinely novel and irreducible. If consciousness is strongly emergent, it constitutes a new category of property absent from underlying information processing. This position is controversial. Strong emergence appears to conflict with causal closure, the principle that physical effects have sufficient physical causes. If consciousness exerts causal influence, it seems to require powers beyond the physical substrate. Weak emergence avoids this difficulty, but reintroduces the original problem. If consciousness is weakly emergent, it should be explicable in informational terms. The question returns, why do particular patterns generate experience? At present, uncertainty remains. The relationship between information and consciousness is unresolved. Correlation is well established, explanation is not. Multiple philosophical interpretations remain open, none decisively confirmed. The issue can be framed simply. A neuroscientist can describe every physical and informational property of a brain state. She can specify neural firings, neurotransmitter release, signal propagation, integration metrics, and computational structure. After this exhaustive account, a question still remains. Why does any of this feel like something? This is not a failure of measurement. Better instruments will not resolve it. The difficulty is conceptual. Complete descriptions of information processing do not logically entail subjective experience. No matter how thoroughly structure and dynamics are specified, the existence of qualitative states remains unexplained. Information, as used in physics and cognitive science, refers to encodable, transmissible patterns. Bits carry information. Neural firing patterns carry information. Information can be measured, manipulated, and governed by mathematical law. But information, in this technical sense, is structural. It describes relationships between states. It does not itself possess experiential qualities. Consider a concrete example. A person sees red. Photoreceptors respond to specific wavelengths. Signals travel through the thalamus to visual cortex, activating populations of neurons. A distributed pattern forms, representing color information. Every step can be described informationally. We can specify which neurons fire, when they fire, and how they interact. We can quantify mutual information and integration across regions. But does this explain the experience of seeing red? Does it capture what that perception feels like? The description explains what the system does. It does not explain why doing this produces experience. The gap between objective processing and subjective experience remains. This is not merely an epistemic limitation, it appears logical. Structural and functional descriptions do not entail experiential properties. From this system processes information in manner X, it does not follow that this system experiences red. The inference fails. Thomas Nagel expressed this problem by asking what it is like to be a bat. Bats use echolocation, perceiving the world through reflected sound waves. We can study bat neurobiology, map auditory cortex, and describe information processing in detail. Yet this does not reveal what echolocation feels like. No amount of structural description conveys the bat's subjective perspective. This is not because bat experience is hidden or inaccessible. Even if direct access were possible, the question would remain, why should that informational architecture generate those experiences? Informational description and experiential reality appear to belong to different categories. Frank Jackson illustrated this again with Mary. She knows every physical and informational fact about colour vision. Yet when she first sees red, she learns something new. The qualitative feel of red was not contained in her prior knowledge. This suggests phenomenal experience exceeds structural description. Some attempt to resolve this by identifying consciousness with information patterns. Integrated information theory does exactly this, grounding consciousness in irreducible integration. Systems with higher integration are more conscious, but the core difficulty persists. Why should integration feel like anything? Integration is a structural property. It describes organization, not experience. The mathematical measure quantifies relationships. It does not explain phenomenology, and so the problem remains unchanged. Informational explanations illuminate structure, causation, and prediction. They do not explain why experience exists at all. David Chalmers has argued that this difficulty represents a fundamental limitation. He distinguishes what he calls the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem. Easy problems concern objective functions, how the brain processes information, how it produces behaviour, how it integrates inputs. These problems are empirically demanding but tractable in principle. They fall within the scope of standard scientific methods. The hard problem asks something different. Why any of this processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all? Why does information processing feel like something? Chalmers suggests that no amount of functional or structural explanation can answer this question. Such explanations describe mechanisms, they specify how systems operate and interact. They do not explain why those mechanisms should generate qualia. The gap on this view is not merely practical, but principled. Structural descriptions and experiential properties appear to be fundamentally different kinds of facts. Some philosophers accept this conclusion and embrace property dualism. Physical processes give rise to conscious experiences, but experiences themselves possess non-physical properties, qualia, that cannot be reduced to physical or informational descriptions. This position takes the explanatory gap seriously, but at a cost. Consciousness becomes partially disconnected from the rest of science, governed by principles that resist integration with physical theory. Others argue instead for strong emergence. Consciousness, on this view, emerges from information processing in a genuinely novel way, not reducible to the underlying processes. But strong emergence introduces its own difficulties. If conscious properties are truly novel and irreducible, how do they fit into the causal structure of the physical world? If they are causally inert, they appear epiphenomenal, mere byproducts without influence. If they possess causal power, they seem to violate the causal closure of physics. A different response rejects the premise altogether. Perhaps there is no explanatory gap. Perhaps our intuitions about what requires explanation are mistaken. On this view, once information processing in the brain is fully understood, the apparent mystery will dissolve. Consciousness will be revealed as nothing over and above certain computational processes. This dissolution strategy, however, faces a challenge of its own. It must explain why the intuition of an explanatory gap is so persistent and widespread. If consciousness is simply information processing, why does it not appear that way to us? Why does it feel like something more? The strategy must either explain away these intuitions or show that they arise from conceptual confusion. Joseph Levine has argued that even identity claims fail to eliminate the gap. Consider pain. Suppose we discover that pain corresponds to C fiber firing. This establishes an identity claim. Pain is C fiber firing. Yet even granting this identity, a question remains. Why does C fiber firing feel painful? Why does it have that particular qualitative character? The identity accounts for correlation, but not for quality. This suggests that informational explanations, no matter how complete, may not fully satisfy our explanatory demands. They describe structures and functions. They account for organization and causal role. They do not account for phenomenal properties, the felt qualities of experience. Something about consciousness resists reduction to purely objective, structural terms. The difficulty is not unique to neuroscience or cognitive science. It arises from the nature of information itself. Information is a relational concept. It describes differences that make a difference. But differences are abstract. They do not inherently possess experiential qualities. A system processing information is a system undergoing rule-governed state changes. Why such changes should feel like anything remains unclear. At present, no framework offers a fully satisfying answer. Physicalism struggles to accommodate irreducible subjectivity. Dualism struggles to explain interaction. Emergence struggles to specify what kind of emergence could bridge the gap. Functionalism struggles to explain why functional organization should generate qualia. Information theory struggles to explain why integrated information should be conscious. Each approach captures something important. Each encounters unresolved difficulties. The persistence of the explanatory gap across frameworks suggests it is not merely an artifact of incomplete science. It may reflect a deeper limitation in how consciousness can be conceptualized. Current scientific understanding establishes robust correlations. Certain neural processes reliably accompany conscious experience. Specific information processing patterns correlate with specific phenomenal states. These correlations guide research and enable prediction, but correlation is not explanation. Identifying neural correlates does not tell us why those processes generate experience. The relationship between information and consciousness therefore remains unclear. Information may be necessary for consciousness. Complex information processing may be a prerequisite for subjective experience, but necessity does not imply sufficiency. The question remains, what, if anything, must be added to information to yield consciousness? Some suggest that nothing needs to be added, that the difficulty lies in our expectations rather than in reality. Others argue that consciousness requires principles beyond information theory. Still others suggest the question itself is malformed, that consciousness cannot be captured within any third-person framework. No consensus has emerged. The hard problem remains hard. Complete structural and informational descriptions of the brain do not logically entail the existence of subjective experience. This is not a temporary gap awaiting better data. It is a conceptual difficulty embedded in the relationship between objective description and subjective reality. The implications are substantial. If information alone cannot explain consciousness, then purely computational theories are insufficient. Uploading a mind to a computer might replicate behavioral functions without preserving experience. Artificial systems might process information without being conscious. Consciousness may require something beyond information, perhaps particular physical substrates, perhaps principles not yet understood. Alternatively, the limitation may lie in our concepts themselves. Consciousness and information may be related in ways we have not yet learned to articulate. The explanatory gap may reflect constraints in our conceptual framework rather than a deep metaphysical divide. The issue remains open, unresolved by both science and philosophy. The question ultimately is not whether consciousness exists. It is why complete informational descriptions of neural processes fail to account for its subjective character. Systems can process information without experience. Information theory describes patterns, correlations, and transitions. It does not by itself include experiential properties. That fact has generated a conceptual difficulty that persists across attempts to explain consciousness in purely physical or computational terms. Others accept the implications of the gap rather than attempting to dissolve it. Dualism holds that consciousness is non-physical. Mental properties exist alongside physical properties without reducing to them. But dualism immediately encounters the interaction problem. How do non-physical mental states causally influence physical brain states? No clear mechanism is available. The view also conflicts with principles commonly assumed in science, such as causal closure, the idea that physical effects have sufficient physical causes. Introducing non-physical causes disrupts this framework. Panpsychism proposes a different response. It suggests that consciousness is fundamental, present at all levels of reality rather than emerging only in complex brains. Integrated information theory, taken at face value, implies a form of panpsychism. Any system with non-zero phi would possess some degree of consciousness. Thermostats, atoms, perhaps even subatomic particles, would then have rudimentary experiences. John Searle has criticised this implication as empty. No coherent account exists of what it would mean for an electron to be conscious. Panpsychism appears to multiply mysteries rather than resolve the original one. Eliminativism takes a more radical stance. It denies that consciousness, as traditionally conceived, exists at all. On this view, folk concepts like qualia are mistaken, comparable to abandoned notions such as phlogiston or vital forces. But eliminativism struggles with an obvious difficulty. Experience itself does not disappear. Even if our concepts are confused, something remains that demands explanation. The felt presence of awareness, the qualitative character of sensation. The persistence of these difficulties suggests that the explanatory gap is not simply an artifact of incomplete science. It may reflect a deeper limit in how physical and informational frameworks relate to phenomenal properties. Current theories identify correlations. Certain brain states reliably accompany certain experiences. Specific patterns of integrated information correlates with specific phenomenal states. These correlations are robust and scientifically valuable. But identifying correlates is not the same as explaining why the correlation holds. Francis Crick emphasized that neural correlates are ontologically neutral. They specify which physical processes accompany consciousness without explaining the relationship itself. Most scientists assume the connection is stronger than a mere correlation, that neural states constitute or generate consciousness, but how this happens remains unclear. What principle links informational patterns to phenomenal properties? No current theory supplies such a principle. Some suggest the problem is intractable because we are attempting to explain consciousness using concepts evolved for different purposes. Human cognition developed to navigate the physical world, not to analyze subjective experience itself. Perhaps consciousness is inherently opaque to minds like ours. Others argue that progress will require new concepts, new mathematical tools, perhaps even new physics, but what such frameworks would look like remains uncertain. What does seem established is that information, structure, and dynamics, while necessary for consciousness, do not appear sufficient. They describe what systems do, how they organize, which states they occupy. They do not explain what it feels like to be those systems. The explanatory gap remains. No consensus exists on whether it can be closed or what closing it would require. Information theory, as applied to physical systems, appears complete on its own terms. Shannon's framework quantifies uncertainty. Kolmogorov complexity measures compressibility. Integrated information theory characterizes irreducible causal structure. Each approach captures something real about how systems process, store, and transform states. Yet when applied to consciousness itself, the felt quality of seeing red, hearing middle C, or experiencing pain, these frameworks encounter a peculiar limitation. They describe what systems do without explaining why doing those things should feel like anything at all. This is not a gap in data. Neuroscience continues to map correlations between brain states and reported experiences with increasing precision. Specific neural patterns reliably accompany specific qualia. The ventral stream processes visual features. The anterior cingulate cortex correlates with pain perception. These findings are robust and replicable. What remains unexplained is the relationship itself. Why does activity in certain neural circuits produce the qualitative character of redness rather than, say, the qualitative character of middle C, or no qualitative character at all? Consider a parallel case from another domain. We explain why water boils at 100 degrees Celsius by describing molecular kinetic energy overcoming intermolecular forces. The explanation succeeds because both the explanandum, boiling, and the explanans, molecular motion, belong to the same ontological category. Both are physical processes accessible to third-person description. Temperature reduces to mean kinetic energy. Phase transitions reduce to binding energy thresholds. Structure and dynamics fully capture what needs explaining. Consciousness presents a different situation. The explanandum, subjective experience, involves first-person qualitative properties. The explanans, neural information processing, involves third-person structural and dynamical properties. No obvious bridge connects the two. This is the structure and dynamics problem. Physical science explains phenomena by specifying structure and function. In many cases, that suffices, but phenomenal consciousness appears to involve something beyond structure and dynamics, the felt quality itself. Integrated information theory attempts to bridge this divide by identifying consciousness with a mathematical quantity by measuring irreducible integrated information. Systems with high phi possess consciousness proportional to their integration. The theory makes concrete predictions about neural architectures and explains why certain brain regions contribute to consciousness while others do not. It offers a level of mathematical precision absent from earlier proposals. But identification is not explanation. Even if phi perfectly correlated with consciousness, even if every conscious system exhibited high phi and every unconscious system low phi, the question would remain: why should integrated information feel like anything? The mathematics describes causal relationships among components. It quantifies how the whole constrains its parts. These are structural and dynamical facts. They do not, by themselves, entail phenomenal qualities. This becomes clearer through thought experiments. Imagine a system with the same phi value as a conscious brain, but implemented differently, using hydraulic pipes instead of neurons or mechanical gears instead of synapses. According to IIT, such a system would be conscious. It would have experiences, but what grounds this claim beyond stipulation? What principle connects abstract integration to the concrete reality of felt experience? The knowledge argument illustrates the gap from another angle. Consider someone named Mary who knows all physical facts about colour vision. She understands the neurophysiology in complete detail, which wavelengths stimulate which photoreceptors, how signals propagate through visual cortex, how colour information integrates with object recognition. She can predict precisely which neural patterns occur when someone sees red. She possesses complete structural and dynamical knowledge of colour processing. Yet Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white environment. She has never seen colour. When she finally leaves that environment and sees red for the first time, she learns something new. She learns what red looks like, but she already possessed all the physical information. This suggests that there exists knowledge beyond the physical, specifically phenomenal knowledge of what experiences are like. Structural and dynamical descriptions, however complete, do not capture phenomenal properties. Some philosophers object to this reasoning. They argue that Mary does not learn new facts, but merely acquires new abilities, the ability to recognize, imagine, or remember red. Others suggest she does learn new facts, but these are physical facts presented under a different mode of access. Knowing red theoretically differs from knowing red experientially, even if both concern the same underlying properties. These responses face difficulties. If phenomenal knowledge is merely ability, why does it present itself as informational? When Mary sees red, she does not simply gain a skill. She discovers something about the world, what this experience is like. And if experiential knowledge is just physical knowledge in a different format, what explains the apparent incommensurability? Why does the gap feel unbridgeable from the first-person perspective? The zombie argument approaches the issue from a different direction. Imagine a being physically and informationally identical to a conscious human, but entirely lacking experience. This philosophical zombie processes information identically. It behaves the same way. It reports being conscious. Yet there is nothing it is like to be this entity. If such a being is conceivable, if no contradiction arises in the description, then consciousness is not logically entailed by physical structure alone. Something further is required. Critics question whether zombies are genuinely conceivable. Perhaps the intuition arises only because we lack a full understanding of the structure-experience relationship. Perhaps perfect physical duplication necessarily includes phenomenal duplication, and our contrary intuitions reflect confusion, or perhaps conceivability does not establish possibility. Many things once seemed conceivable: water that is not H2O, heat without molecular motion, but turned out to be impossible. But the zombie argument does not rely on metaphysical possibility. It relies only on the absence of logical contradiction, and none is apparent. There is nothing logically incoherent about a system that processes information identically to us while lacking phenomenal states. This absence of entailment suggests that information processing alone underdetermines consciousness. Thomas Nagel's bat argument reinforces this conclusion. Bats navigate using echolocation, a sensory modality humans lack. We can study bat neurobiology extensively. We can map auditory pathways. We can model information flow through their nervous systems. But we still cannot know what echolocation feels like to a bat. The experiential perspective remains inaccessible. This is not merely about human cognitive limits. The deeper point is that structural and informational descriptions, no matter how complete, do not capture subjective character. They describe organization and causal role. They omit what it is like to be the system. And if bat phenomenology cannot be derived from complete information about bat brains, it is unclear how information alone could constitute or explain consciousness. Functionalism offers another approach. It defines mental states by their functional roles, their causes, effects, and relations to other states. Pain is whatever state is caused by tissue damage, produces avoidance behavior, and interacts with attention and memory in characteristic ways. This framework allows mental states to be realized in multiple substrates. Silicon systems could, in principle, instantiate pain. Yet functionalism encounters the same difficulty. Functional roles are relational and causal properties. They specify what states do, not what they are like. Complete functional specification leaves qualitative character unexplained. Why should states with these functional roles feel like anything? Why should any functional organization produce subjective experience rather than unconscious processing? Ned Block's China brain thought experiment makes this vivid. Suppose the population of China organizes to simulate the functional architecture of a human brain. Each person plays the role of a neuron, communicating according to fixed rules. The overall system implements the same functional organization as a conscious brain. According to functionalism, the system would be conscious, but this conclusion seems implausible. A coordinated nation does not appear to form a single experiencing subject. Consciousness seems tied to more than an abstract functional pattern. Taken together, these considerations suggest that information, structure, and dynamics, while necessary for consciousness, are not sufficient. They describe what conscious systems do and how they are organized. They do not explain why organized systems have experiences. The explanatory gap persists, not as a loose end, but as a stable feature of our best attempts to understand consciousness. Some responses accept the gap while denying that it carries deep metaphysical consequences. On this view, the difficulty is conceptual rather than ontological. The problem arises from how we think about consciousness, not from the nature of consciousness itself. Our concepts of physical processes and phenomenal experience developed independently, serving different explanatory roles. We simply lack the conceptual tools needed to connect them. But this, proponents argue, does not imply that consciousness is non-physical or inexplicable in principle. It suggests only that our current conceptual framework is incomplete. This response faces obvious challenges. If the gap is merely conceptual, why has it resisted conceptual progress for so long? Philosophers and scientists have examined consciousness with increasing rigor for decades. If improved concepts could bridge the gap, why have they not emerged? And if we cannot even outline how information might entail experience, what grounds confidence that such an entailment exists at all? Other responses take more radical directions. Dualism holds that consciousness is fundamentally non-physical. Panpsychism proposes that rudimentary consciousness exists throughout the physical world. Illusionism denies that phenomenal consciousness exists as ordinarily conceived. Each position has defenders. Each encounters serious difficulties. None commands widespread agreement. What does seem clear is that existing physical and informational frameworks do not explain phenomenal consciousness. They identify correlates and necessary conditions. They specify features that appear required: integration, information processing, particular neural architectures. But necessity does not amount to sufficiency. The central question, why any informational structure should be accompanied by subjective experience, remains unanswered. This is not a gap that closes by accumulating more data or refining models. It reflects a limitation in our explanatory framework itself. Perhaps the deepest unresolved issue in science concerns why certain physical systems are accompanied by experience. Complete neurological descriptions specify what happens when photons strike retinal cells, how electrical signals propagate through visual cortex, how information integrates across distributed networks. These descriptions capture structure, spatial organization, temporal firing patterns, functional relationships. They capture dynamics, how states evolve and interact. Yet something appears absent. They explain what the system does and how it is organized. They do not explain why doing these things should feel like anything at all. This is not simply a matter of incomplete knowledge. It is not that neuroscience has yet to fill in missing details. The difficulty is conceptual. Structural and information theoretic explanations appear to be the wrong kind of explanation for phenomenal consciousness. They operate in a different logical register from facts about what experience is like. Consider integrated information theory. It proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information, information that cannot be reduced to independent components. A system's consciousness, measured by phi, reflects how much information it generates as a unified whole beyond what its parts generate separately. Hi-Fi indicates both differentiation and integration. Information processing becomes irreducible. The framework has empirical traction. It predicts when consciousness fades during deep sleep or anesthesia as integration decreases. When neural activity becomes too uniform or too chaotic, integration collapses and experience disappears. The theory connects measurable physical properties to the presence or absence of consciousness. Yet the conceptual problem remains. Integrated information is defined entirely in terms of structure and dynamics, causal relations, constraints among states, patterns of interaction. These are third-person objective properties. Phi can be calculated from outside a system by analysing its causal architecture. Consciousness, by contrast, involves first-person properties, what it is like from within. The gap appears principled. No amount of structural or dynamical information logically entails phenomenal properties. One could know everything about Phi, every mathematical detail of how a system integrates information, and still reasonably ask why that integration should be accompanied by experience. Why should any degree of causal integration, however complex, yield subjective qualities rather than unconscious processing? This is what philosophers refer to as the hard problem. It is not about explaining functions, how systems discriminate stimuli, integrate inputs, or guide behavior. Those problems, while difficult, fall within standard scientific explanation. The hard problem concerns the qualitative character of experience itself. Why does information processing in certain systems, but apparently not others, come with an inner life? Consider what a complete physical description would include. It would specify particle positions, field configurations, causal relations, and dynamical laws in exhaustive detail. It would describe the physical structure of the universe entirely. Yet from such a description, it is unclear how facts about consciousness could be derived. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument illustrates this. Mary is a scientist who knows all physical facts about colour vision. She understands wavelengths, photoreceptor responses, neural processing in visual cortex, everything physics and neuroscience can provide. But she has lived her life in a black and white environment. She has never seen colour. When Mary sees red for the first time, does she learn something new? Intuitively, yes. She learns what red looks like, but she already knew all physical facts. Whatever she learns does not appear to be captured by physical information alone. It seems to concern phenomenal character. Standard replies deny this intuition. They suggest Mary gains only new abilities, or that she acquires old information under a new mode of presentation, or they argue that her new knowledge is practical rather than factual. Yet these responses often feel strained. The persistent intuition is that phenomenal knowledge differs from physical and informational knowledge in kind. The zombie argument sharpens the issue. We can coherently imagine beings physically and informationally identical to conscious humans, yet lacking experience entirely. These philosophical zombies process information identically, behave identically, and report being conscious, but there is nothing it is like to be them. This does not show that zombies are metaphysically possible. Conceivability does not guarantee possibility, but it does suggest that no logical contradiction arises when physical organization is separated from phenomenal experience. The connection between the two does not resemble the connection between water and H2O, where understanding molecular structure explains macroscopic behavior. With consciousness, knowing the structure appears insufficient. Some accept this and appeal to emergence. Consciousness, they argue, arises from physical processes without being reducible to them. Complex systems often display properties absent from their parts. Liquidity arises from molecular interactions, even though individual molecules are not liquid. Perhaps consciousness arises similarly from neural patterns. But the analogy falters. Liquidity is definable in terms of molecular motion. Once the microdynamics are understood, the macro property follows. Consciousness does not behave this way. No description of neural dynamics, however complete, seems to entail subjective experience. The gap persists. This is why integrated information theory, despite its empirical strengths, confronts the same conceptual difficulty as earlier theories. It correlates consciousness with integration. It may correctly predict when consciousness occurs, but correlation does not explain why integration should be accompanied by experience. The theory remains silent on that point. Thomas Nagel articulated this difficulty decades ago. Studying bat neurobiology will not reveal what echolocation feels like to a bat. We can map every neural pathway, every information flow, every computational function, but the subjective character of bat experience remains out of reach. It is tied to a particular point of view that objective descriptions do not capture. This perspectival nature of consciousness presents a deep puzzle. Physics describes the world from no specific viewpoint. Its laws are maximally objective. Consciousness, by contrast, is inherently perspectival. Experience is always experience for someone. This first-person structure appears incompatible with third-person physical description. One response is to appeal again to conceptual limitation. Perhaps future frameworks will render the connection intelligible. Just as earlier thinkers could not conceive heat as molecular motion, perhaps we cannot yet conceive experience as information processing. The gap may reflect our present limitations rather than the structure of reality. This response has some plausibility. Conceptual progress does occur, but the analogy is imperfect. Heat and motion are both physical concepts. Consciousness involves phenomenal concepts that do not obviously reduce to physical ones, and sustained analysis has not clarified how such a reduction might proceed. The persistence of the problem suggests something more than temporary conceptual inadequacy. The issue sharpens when computational systems are considered. If consciousness depends solely on information processing, then any system implementing the appropriate computations should be conscious, regardless of substrate. Silicon systems running the right algorithms would possess experience. Even simple systems might have rudimentary consciousness. This line of reasoning leads naturally toward panpsychism. Consciousness becomes a fundamental feature of reality, present wherever information is processed. Some versions of integrated information theory accept this implication. Even simple systems with non-zero phi possess minimal experience. But panpsychism brings its own difficulties. It clashes with intuition. It raises unresolved questions about how micro-consciousness combines into unified experience, and it arguably relocates rather than resolves the original problem. Why should information integration, or any physical property, be accompanied by experience in the first place? The alternative is to accept the explanatory gap as permanent. Information, structure, and dynamics describe what conscious systems do. They may even predict when consciousness occurs with perfect accuracy, but they do not explain why it occurs, why certain physical arrangements have subjective character. That question may lie outside their explanatory reach. This conclusion does not invoke mysticism, it acknowledges conceptual limits. Just as formal systems contain truths they cannot prove, perhaps physical descriptions contain facts they cannot explain. Consciousness may be such a fact, present, correlated with physical processes, yet not derivable from them. Where this leaves us remains uncertain. We can map neural correlates. We can refine predictive theories. We may even engineer systems that behave like conscious agents. But understanding why these systems have inner lives, why there is something it is like to be them, remains unresolved. The question persists not because of ignorance, but because of the nature of the problem itself. A complete explanation of consciousness appears to require two kinds of information. One describes behavior, structure, and function. The other concerns what experience feels like. A full account of the first does not automatically generate the second. This asymmetry defines the conceptual difficulty. Consider a system processing visual information. Neural patterns correlate with wavelength detection. Categorization mechanisms engage. Memory systems activate. Behavior follows. This entire sequence can be specified in exhaustive detail. Every causal relation can be mapped, yet something remains unspecified: the qualitative character of seeing red, the subjective aspect accompanying these processes. Information theory, as used in physics and neuroscience, quantifies relationships between states. It measures correlation, integration, differentiation. These are structural properties. They describe organization and causal influence. But conscious experience involves properties that do not reduce to structure alone, properties traditionally called qualia: the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sound of middle C. These features resist translation into purely structural terms. This difference gives rise to what is often called the explanatory gap. We can explain how visual systems process wavelength information. We can predict when subjects will report seeing red. We can correlate patterns of neural activity with specific reported experiences. But we cannot explain why these particular physical processes should be accompanied by this particular phenomenal quality. The gap is not empirical. More data alone will not close it. It is conceptual. Structural descriptions, by their nature, appear insufficient to entail phenomenal properties. Integrated information. Theory attempts to address this gap by identifying consciousness with a particular kind of informational structure. On this view, systems possess consciousness when they generate high levels of integrated information, when their components interact in ways that cannot be decomposed into independent subsystems. The theory supplies mathematical tools for quantifying this integration and predicts that consciousness should track its magnitude. Yet identifying consciousness with integrated information encounters a basic objection. The objection concerns the logical relationship between structural properties and phenomenal properties. Integrated information is defined purely in structural terms. It describes patterns of causal influence within a system. These patterns can be specified exhaustively using mathematical relationships and physical states. Phenomenal consciousness, by contrast, appears to involve something beyond structure: the qualitative character of experience itself. The gap becomes more apparent through thought experiments. Imagine a complete physical description of a particular brain state. This description specifies every neuron's firing pattern, every synaptic strength, every relevant chemical concentration. It maps causal relationships and information flows in full detail. Now ask whether this description logically entails what the experience feels like. Does knowing the structure force knowledge of the phenomenal quality? It seems it does not. One can coherently imagine a system with the same physical structure, accompanied by different phenomenal qualities. One can imagine identical neural patterns associated with entirely different experiences. This apparent conceivability suggests that no logical bridge connects structural descriptions to phenomenal properties. If a connection exists, it appears contingent rather than necessary. The knowledge argument highlights this gap from another angle. Consider someone who knows every physical fact about color vision, every neural pathway, every computational transformation, every behavioral disposition. They understand the complete informational structure of color processing. Yet they have never seen color themselves, having lived in a monochrome environment. When they finally see red, do they learn something new? Most people judge that they do. They learn what red looks like, a phenomenal fact not contained in structural descriptions. This suggests that phenomenal knowledge forms a distinct category, not reducible to physical information. Even complete structural knowledge appears to leave something out, the qualitative character of experience itself. Functionalism offers a different strategy. It identifies mental states with functional roles rather than particular physical implementations. Pain, on this view, is whatever state is caused by tissue damage, produces avoidance behavior, and occupies the appropriate position in a cognitive system. This definition seems to capture everything behaviorally relevant while remaining neutral about physical substrate, but functional definitions face the same difficulty. Specifying a functional role does not explain why occupying that role should feel like anything. A system could implement the pain function, respond appropriately to damage, guide behavior, without any accompanying phenomenal quality. The functional description specifies causal relations and outputs. It does not entail qualitative character. Critics sometimes reply that this gap reflects limitations in our conceptual framework rather than a genuine mystery. Perhaps we currently lack the concepts needed to see the connection. Future conceptual developments might render the relationship between structure and phenomenology intelligible, just as earlier conceptual shifts revealed how temperature could be understood as molecular motion. This response has some force. Conceptual frameworks do evolve. What once seemed inexplicable can later appear natural, but the consciousness case differs in an important respect. Reducing temperature to molecular motion involved relating one physical concept to another. Consciousness requires relating phenomenal concepts to physical ones, a fundamentally different task. And sustained philosophical analysis has not clarified how such a reduction might proceed, or even what form it would take. The problem sharpens when artificial systems are considered. If consciousness depends solely on information structure, then any system implementing the appropriate computations should be conscious. Silicon-based systems running the right algorithms would possess experience. Even simple systems might have rudimentary consciousness if their information satisfies the relevant criteria. This leads to difficult questions. Does a thermostat possess minimal consciousness? What about a photodiode? These systems process information and respond to inputs. If consciousness follows from information structure alone, where does it begin? Some versions of integrated information theory accept this broad distribution. They hold that many systems possess some degree of phenomenal experience, though most are vastly simpler than human consciousness. Consciousness becomes a fundamental feature of reality, present wherever information integrates sufficiently rather than a property unique to complex brains. But this panpsychist implication faces objections. It conflicts with ordinary intuitions about which systems seem conscious. It leaves unresolved the problem of how micro-consciousness combines into unified experience, and it arguably shifts the mystery rather than resolving it. The original question remains, why should information integration be accompanied by experience at all? The alternative is to accept the explanatory gap as persistent. Information structure describes what conscious systems do. It may predict when consciousness occurs with great accuracy, but it does not explain why it occurs, why these arrangements have subjective character. That question appears to lie outside the scope of structural explanation. This conclusion does not appeal to mysticism. It recognizes conceptual limits. Formal systems contain truths they cannot prove, as Gödel showed. Perhaps physical descriptions similarly contain facts they cannot explain. Consciousness may be such a fact, present in the world, correlated with physical processes, yet not derivable from physical descriptions alone. Consider the practical implications. We can map neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision. We can identify which brain states accompany which experiences. We can develop theories predicting the presence or absence of consciousness. We may even construct systems for which we have strong reasons to ascribe consciousness. But understanding why these systems have inner lives, why they feel like something, remains conceptually unresolved. The question persists not because of ignorance, but because of its structure. Information describes relations between states. Consciousness involves something beyond relations, the intrinsic quality of states themselves. No amount of relational information seems sufficient to specify that quality. Structure and dynamics yield only further structure and dynamics, not phenomenology. This leaves consciousness in an unusual position. It is the most certain aspect of our knowledge. We are directly acquainted with our own experiences. Yet it is also the most resistant to explanation. Most phenomena yield to structural analysis. Consciousness alone does not. Not because data are missing, but because the form of structural explanation appears mismatched to the phenomenon. Where this gap ultimately leads remains unclear. It may indicate missing physics, new principles linking structure and phenomenology. It may suggest the need for radically new conceptual tools, or it may mark a genuine boundary on what structural explanation can achieve. These possibilities remain open precisely because the gap itself resists closure. What can be said with confidence is this: information alone does not explain consciousness. It characterizes patterns and processes. It predicts behavior and correlations, but it does not capture, perhaps cannot capture, the qualitative character that defines experience. The hardness of the hard problem lies not in complexity, but in the conceptual distance between structure and phenomenology. That distance at present remains unbridged. We are left confronting a question that admits no settled resolution. The explanatory gap between informational structure and phenomenal experience persists across theoretical frameworks. No existing theory successfully derives qualitative properties from quantitative descriptions. Integration measures predict correlations without explaining them. Functional specifications account for behavior without accounting for feeling. Neural mappings identify what occurs when consciousness is present, not why those occurrences generate subjective states. This is not a failure of scientific method. Science advances by relating observable properties through formal laws. Information theory quantifies uncertainty reduction. Neuroscience maps causal pathways. Both succeed within their domains. The difficulty emerges when these tools are applied to phenomenology itself, to the felt quality that distinguishes conscious experience from unconscious processing. Perhaps future frameworks will resolve this. Perhaps conceptual progress will render the connection transparent. But such progress would require something unprecedented, a way of deriving first-person facts from third-person descriptions, qualitative properties from structural relations. No model for such derivation currently exists. Alternatively, the gap may be permanent, not because of intellectual limitation or missing data, but because of the logical structure of the problem. If consciousness involves properties irreducible to information, properties accessible only through direct acquaintance, then informational explanation encounters a boundary. Not a temporary obstacle, but a conceptual limit. Where this leaves scientific understanding of consciousness remains uncertain. We can continue mapping correlates, refining predictions, and constructing increasingly detailed models of information processing in brains. These efforts matter. They deepen understanding of consciousness's physical basis and behavioural manifestations, but they may never answer the question that motivates them. Why does any physical arrangement, any informational structure, any computational process produce subjective experience rather than proceeding without awareness? That question remains as difficult now as when first articulated, perhaps more so as the depth of the conceptual challenge has become clearer. This is not pessimism, it is intellectual honesty. Recognizing where structural explanation ends is itself progress. It clarifies what science explains, what remains open, and why certain questions may resist our most powerful tools.